Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this Monday, it is the 10th day of February, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. As I'm sure you know, I guess I was guilty of taking a little break. I had a visitor. My brother was visiting me from Massachusetts last week, and he drove down to watch the Super Bowl with me while my wife was gone. And I kind of had to make some calls because I said I really can't afford to not just take the 2 hours for the program, but also the 2 or 3 hours preparation for each program. And I really felt a little bit uncomfortable where he was visiting me, taking that much time away from him. So I guess we replayed some programs from the past last week. So it's been a week since we've been together, and I am thrilled to be here with you here at the Virtual Center. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to talk about. I thought I knew all weekend long what I was going to do on the first program back after taking a week's leave of absence. But lo and behold, I had a last-minute change, and sometimes those are a mistake, but oftentimes they work out well. I hope that in this case it's the latter rather than the former. Again, I look forward to hearing from you. We have a telephone number that we are making available just for you, and we will put you directly on the air if you would choose to participate in our program. The number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. I had to remind myself what my email address was. You know, you don't use your own email too often, so it's waobrien906@gmail.com. Before we get into anything else today, I wanted to comment. I'm sure Bob Kincaid will comment later this evening during his program on his rather busy weekend. As I'm sure some of you know, and I hope I'm not blowing his cover for his program tonight at all. But as some of you may know, Bob was invited to appear live with Melissa Harris Perry on MSNBC yesterday morning. He was on at the 11:30 segment of the program. He was on a panel of 4 talking about the issue of clean water, not just here in West Virginia, but also the severe drought that continues in California, as well as news of a recent leak in North Carolina on a coal ash situation in western North Carolina, where something like 82,000 gallons of waste has leaked into the water system there. Obviously, we're looking at a very, very serious situation in terms of people's ability to have faith in their own water, that they can have clear drinking water. And I was reading in our local Charleston Gazette newspaper today a piece about what the costs to the West Virginia, especially the Charleston economy, of this water situation here, this chemical spill into the Elk River that occurred a month ago, actually now, what the impact is going to be on the economy in terms of tourists who aren't coming to Charleston because they can't trust the water. And the estimate that one business professor from Marshall University put on this crisis was something like $61 million in lost revenue to businesses and to the community as a whole as a result of this water disaster in Charleston. And as some of you may know, today there is a congressional hearing taking place in in Charleston, on this water situation. Of course, one of the comments made by our own Senator Joe Manchin was an effort to try to suggest that the federal government has responsibility here to assure the people of West Virginia about the cleanliness and safety of their water supply. I found that a little bit interesting, since Senator Manchin has been outspoken in his rhetoric against the EPA and against the federal government's interfering within states into matters that he believes are state affairs. Now suddenly we're looking toward the federal government, in fact suggesting that the federal government is in part responsible for cleaning up this mess. I think it's incredible. But I wanted to make a comment or two before we got into anything else today. About the significance of Head-On's own Bob Kincaid appearing with Melissa Harris Perry on MSNBC. And specifically, I'd like to relate it to an interview program that I saw on West Virginia Public Broadcasting last Thursday evening. And an attorney from Morgantown, West Virginia, home of West Virginia University, is Dan Ringer. Dan is an attorney, a practicing attorney, has been so for years. He's also heavily involved in West Virginia Public Broadcasting. He serves on the board. He does a regular program during West Virginia Public Broadcasting's pledge drives, especially the TV side, not so much the radio side as the TV side of fundraising for West Virginia Public Television. And Dan has a weekly program here in West Virginia on West Virginia Public Television entitled Law Works. And on that program weekly, Dan invites attorneys to talk about the legal ramifications and the legal situations surrounding public interest issues related to the law. This past Thursday, the topic of discussion was the chemical spill into the Elk River and its impact on the people of not only Charleston, but the 9 counties surrounding the state capital of Charleston. The 9 counties served by the American Water Company, whose water processing plant was infected, if you will, by this chemical spill. And Professor McGinley from West Virginia University Law School was making the point that West Virginia for a long time has been the victim of what he calls an anti-regulation bias, a clear distrust of government's regulatory role over the economy. And Professor McGinley pointed out in the course of this discussion that this anti-regulation mentality that is so prominent in West Virginia and has been for so long is directly linked to the efforts of corporations within West Virginia, coal, timber, chemicals, to basically create an atmosphere in West Virginia which connected government regulation of corporate behavior and business practices in West Virginia with the elimination of jobs. For a long time, corporate interests that have a direct impact on the environment in West Virginia, and I guess right now the two best examples would be coal and chemicals, have spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of dollars to convince West Virginians that too much government interference and too much regulation of corporate behavior in West Virginia would cost West Virginia jobs. And in fact, this campaign is being funded in the with the fall November elections, November 2014 congressional elections coming up this fall, against West Virginia's current Democratic congressman from southern West Virginia, Nick Rahal. And already there is a media blitz underway in West Virginia suggesting this idea that federal policies being supported by southern West Virginia's current Democratic congressman are costing West Virginia families jobs. And specifically, they're pointing to the congressman's vote on certain pieces of legislation that they are arguing are hurting West Virginia families and costing West Virginia jobs, that are part of the National Democratic Party's agenda of over-regulating corporate behavior. And Professor McGinley was pointing out that this anti-regulatory or anti-regulation mentality that is quite well established here in West Virginia is the product of a long and very expensive effort to create an anti-Washington mentality here in West Virginia, which is playing into the hands of chemical companies and coal companies who have been very successful in garnering public opinion and public support against government regulation, against the EPA, against efforts to protect the environment. It is a mentality that has produced the idea that all environmentalists are so-called tree huggers, and that they are primarily regulatory efforts of environmentalists against mountaintop removal, against regulating the behavior of chemical companies and coal companies. The argument goes, have cost and continue to cost West Virginians valuable jobs in a state which is in dire need of jobs. And Professor McGinley's point is that a result of this has not only been the kind of corporate behavior that produced the recent spill, but more important, the rush to protect corporations that we saw on the part of West Virginia government as a reaction to this environmental disaster. And the fact of the matter is, this anti-regulation mentality, this value system, has been carefully crafted in such a way that it feeds in to the West Virginia state motto, Montani semper liberi, which mountaineers are always free, which mountaineers have been so proud of for so long, that there's something very special about West Virginians, about people who are born and raised here in the state that is almost heaven. And the campaign, and I'm thinking specifically of an organization that has been formed here in West Virginia called Friends of Coal, and how effective it has been in shaping and building this anti-regulation, anti-Washington mentality, which is so very strong here in West Virginia. And the fact of the matter is, it is a key factor in the transition from what ought to be clearly a blue state into what in recent elections has become a very predictable red state. And there is serious possibility here that West Virginia is going to be the next state to go Republican and to lose its Democratic majority in the state legislature. Right now, it looks like in the fall election of 2014, the balance between Republicans and Democrats in the West Virginia legislature is very, very close. Something in the area of five delegates, as I recall. Consequently, national Republicans see West Virginia as a possible pickup in Congress. Consequently, vast amounts of advertising coming out of Washington, coming out of the National Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and some of these other private organizations who don't need to identify themselves, have started an anti-Nick Rahal, anti-Democrat, anti-Washington campaign here early in February, with the election not until November. I think it's very, very significant for national political reasons what's going on here. It's also very significant for the response to the chemical spill that West Virginians have been responding to over the last month. That, I think, forms the backdrop for the significance of Bob Kincaid's appearance on national television, specifically on MSNBC's Melissa Harris Perry's program on Sunday morning. For a long, long time, West Virginia has in part been victimized by the fact that it is West Virginia. And what I mean is, what goes on in West Virginia for a long time has been pretty much not part of the national agenda. National news has tended not to focus that much on West Virginia except when there is a natural disaster, as there was in 1972 in the Buffalo Creek disaster, as we saw a few years ago in the 29 miners being killed here in southern West Virginia in Raleigh County, right where I'm sitting now, as a result of the behavior of coal. And so those spectacular tragedies bring the national media into West Virginia. But other than that, for all practical purposes, what goes on in West Virginia has pretty much been reported by those who have clearly an agenda. And those who have been reaping most of the profits from West Virginia for decades have pretty much been in control of what the national media knows about what's going on in West Virginia. Bob Kincaid's appearance on MSNBC on Sunday morning and the appearances previous to that are an indication that that is changing. And to use an expression we've all heard of, only since the first of the year, only since this chemical spill, I keep saying skill, it's hardly skill, it's spill, have we had a situation in West Virginia where the whole world is watching. The whole nation is kind of aware of what's happened here. The whole nation is shaking its head in disbelief that a month after the event, West Virginians are still unsure of the safety of their own water. Bob brought up as part of his remarks on Sunday morning, and this clearly got the attention of the people who were on the panel with him. And I thought the example was absolutely perfect. If the media had reported a month ago that a terrorist had dumped 10,000 gallons of anything into the water supply serving Charleston and the immediate counties around it, the state of West Virginia, the governor, would have shut down the water supply immediately. But a corporate spill? It took the governor 8 hours to shut down American Water Company's water supply. And Bob used the example, imagine the new mother who during that 8-hour period was bathing an infant. Harris Perry followed up with an example of a mother mixing a formula for an infant during that same period. In other words, how do we in West Virginia define crisis? Through tragedy after tragedy, we have heard, and I'm a big supporter of this, please don't misinterpret what I'm saying. When Joe Manchin was governor of West Virginia, his response during the mine disaster when we lost 29 miners in the mine disaster, his response was to be on site during that entire period when the families were holding out hope for those miners. And Joe Manchin was the one who assumed the responsibility of telling those families that all but one of those miners was not going to come out alive. And Joe Manchin handled that beautifully, handled that well. I don't think there's anybody that would criticize the way the governor handled that. And in the process, once again, West Virginia's governor praised West Virginians and the way West Virginians come together and support each other during this kind of crisis. West Virginia's industrial history has been the history of crisis after crisis, from the Cold Wars of the early 20th century all the way up to the most recent disasters, including this chemical spill. Granted, it appears nobody's lost their life. This particular chemical is not lethal, I guess, but it could have been. And once again, we hear West Virginia's governor and West Virginia's public officials praising the toughness of West Virginians who seem to be able to pull together during crises like these as no people anywhere else could ever do. And we hear this all the time. I would suggest to you, unfortunately, that part of the reasons West Virginians have been able to do that is because they've had to do that. Because their government traditionally springs to the defense of corporations before it springs to the defense of people. And I think we've seen it in disaster after disaster, and we've seen it in this one. And once again, the message is we've got to make sure that nothing like this happens again. We've got to pass the kind of legislation or enforce the legislation that's already on the books to make sure that this kind of disaster can never happen again. Almost an echo from the mine disaster that cost 29 miners their lives. Indeed, West Virginians are tough. But what's going to make this situation different than previous ones, I predict, is symbolized by Bob Kincaid's appearance on national television. From now on, the national media is going to know what's happening in West Virginia, not getting their news, so to speak, from the people who have an agenda or a vested interest in what gets out there and what doesn't. And that's what I see as being so significant about this particular situation. And the fact that the person carrying our water, no pun intended here, carrying West Virginia's water in this particular situation is Bob Kincaid, our own Bob Kincaid, is, I believe, quite legitimate and quite just. I think that's as it should be. He's the right person to do it. He's earned the right to do it. And the fact that the media on a national level is clearly putting credibility in what Bob Kincaid is telling them, I think is very significant for West Virginians and for the future of West Virginians. So I think this is a very, very significant issue. I think Bob's appearance is very significant for the reasons that I mentioned. I think the mentality, this anti-regulatory mentality, the assumption that regulation by definition costs jobs. Professor McGinley made the point on last Thursday evening that that does not necessarily follow. There's regulation and there's regulation. There's the kind of regulation that guarantees the quality of work being done. There's the kind of regulation that guarantees that the development of a state's natural resources does not have to be at the expense of the future people of the state. That we can have regulation and have economic growth as well. And the reality of true progressive regulation is that the availability and the ongoing presence of accountability means that the work being done is quality work. Oversight of production, oversight of the delivery of services, oversight of the management of the environment. All of these, done right, can be a generator of jobs, not an eliminator of jobs. And the fact that West Virginians have this mentality that if the federal government is here, jobs go. West Virginians believe that because that's what they've been told by the people who have a vested interest in keeping Washington out. And by shining the national light on what's going on internally in West Virginia, for the first time, I see hope and potential progress here. I see legislation that is going to be meaningful legislation. But I think it's also important to recognize the amount of out-of-state money that is being poured into West Virginia in order to fund a campaign based on West Virginia jobs and West Virginia families, when the people who are paying for these ads know nothing about West Virginia jobs or West Virginia families. It is absolutely vital that the citizens of West Virginia begin to understand what's happening in their best interests and what might be happening against their best interests. And when they do, the potential of West Virginia will be unlimited. I believe that, and I believe that what we are witnessing is the beginning of a change, a progressive change. And again, I think in part, we have Bob Kincaid and the Head On Radio Network to thank for that. And if you've ever doubted why it's important to keep this voice out there, I think we're beginning to see the payoff now. And I think that can only begin to get better and more pronounced. It is absolutely vital. We've been doing the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility here for about 8 months. I believe since last April. I believe that's when we started. Bob may have the date marked down. I don't. I don't remember exactly when we started. But ever since then, I have believed. In fact, when we were conceptualizing this program, I believed that it was absolutely vital that this voice remain vibrant. And now I'm beginning to see results, positive results from it. And my hat is off to Bob and to the people at Head On and to you, the audience, who have supported and continue to support this network. There's a payoff here, and it is beginning to happen. And all of you are to be credited for that change. And I want you to know that I appreciate it. And I hope you appreciate how important you are to making sure that this voice becomes louder and louder as the payoff begins to happen. We are at the bottom of the hour, first hour, and one of the things that I would like to, I'd like to take this idea of mentality, this so-called anti-regulatory mentality, and tie it a little bit into some history, into some substance. Because I think it's quite significant, it's quite important, and to be a little bit vain, I think it's really kind of interesting. It's not mine alone, but over the years, these kinds of connections are the kinds of things that I have seen as I've studied and taught history over the years. I think these things are quite significant. I think they're quite important. And I think this example that we've been talking about is a classic example as to why these things are important and why the origins of these values are so very, very important. And why certain people are willing, literally, to put millions of dollars on the table to make sure that for them the right message is sent, and for them the wrong message is not sent. I think it's very, very significant. I think it's educational, and I think it ties directly into the mission of this program, which is to focus not only on the document that we have called the Constitution of the United States. But the significance of that document and the meaning of that document as it has evolved through the years and through the decades. There's absolutely no question. I think we've made this point over and over again in times we've focused on education, that the idea of an educated citizenry as the driving force that makes a Republican form of government work is critical. And in this case, what we are talking about is the education of citizens about the very political system in which they live and in which they, by which they are governed. And the relationship that ought to exist in a Republican form of government between citizens and their elected representatives. I think all of this is significant. All of this is meaningful in understanding the nature of the constitutional system we have here in this republic we call the United States of America. And I think the values and the assumptions which drive behavior in this republic are critical. So again, what is it that really explains this anti-regulatory, anti-regulation, anti-Washington, anti-big government mentality, environment that we have pinned on West Virginia corporations? It's much bigger than that. It's the same mission and the same set of assumptions that drive the Tea Party, that drive conservative politicos in today's society. It is the way to explain the similarities and differences between political parties in America's politics of 2013, 2014. It's the kind of political agenda, it is the summation of the political assumptions that drive the economic system that we call free enterprise capitalism in America. All of it is linked, all of it is important, and all of it must be understood by the citizens of this country in order for the republic that the founders have given us, in order for it to work the way it ought to work. I think it is very, very significant. So with that, let me again share with you our phone number and a little bit of information. One of the things I neglected to mention at the outset of our program today is that tomorrow will have to be one of those days where we run 1 hour early. We'll be on in the East from 3 to 5 p.m. tomorrow rather than 4 to 6. I have an obligation tomorrow afternoon as part of my role as a Rotarian here in the Beckley Rotary Club. We have an event tomorrow evening that begins at 5:30 here in southern West Virginia, which I have to be there. And so in order to do that, we're going to have to basically run our program from 3 to 5 rather than 4 to 6 tomorrow. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. I also want to make sure that everybody has the phone number. We would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. I have mentioned in programs past, in our past time together, that I continue to teach college and university level history classes. I think as long as I am functioning, I almost have to do that. I feel almost it's just a part of me. I've been doing it for more than a half century. And the fact of the matter is, one of the things that occurs to me, and I may have mentioned this before, I mentioned it in my class the other day, one of the things that really disturbs me as I look back over the way that I used to teach some of this material when I first started. And I keep thinking, oh, what I didn't know then that I know now. If there was only some way that I could revisit classes that I've had in the past and bring some of the insight that research, continuous reading, and I guess maturity allows me to bring to the table that I didn't know before. And one of the issues, one of the areas that I have found fascinating is this issue of values. The things we value, where they come from. Political scientists have many of them have spent entire careers on what they call in the discipline political socialization. In other words, where do citizens in this republic get their ideas about government, about politics, about the duties of a citizen, about the need for an educated citizenry? Where does all of this stuff come from? And for generations, political scientists have been focusing on the extent to which our political socialization has its roots in the family, has its roots in communities, has its roots in the workplace, has its roots in religion, has its roots in economics, has its roots in the political biases and prejudices of political leaders of the past, has its roots in our own history. And political scientists have been focusing on that, trying to argue or trying to suggest what the major origins of a political value system for our young people is. Is it our schools? Is it our economy? Is it employers who drive that economy? Is it the people we work with as part of our day-to-day efforts to survive and function within this economy? Political scientists have made reputations, scholarly reputations, based on research into some of these questions. And one of the things that I have found to be particularly revealing about contemporary political socialization, where our political ideas and political values come from, I found to be rooted in the late 19th century. In that period of American history, from the end of the Civil War and reconstruction of the Union into the turn into the 20th century and the years leading up to World War I. In other words, if I were to put dates on those, I would say that period of American history from 1865, the end of the Civil War, to 1914, the outbreak of World War I. During that period, the United States of America experiences what we call, for lack of a more precise term, the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, it was a revolution. The United States of America was late showing up to the Industrial Revolution party. Europe had been undergoing the positives as well as the negatives of industrialism long before the United States got into the game in a big way. There's a reason for that. Throughout its early history, up until the Civil War itself, the United States had been held back in terms of economic development, in terms of industrial development, by the need to try to hold the Union together by compromising with Southern slavery. More than anything else, the threat of the South to leave the Union during the nation's first century became a critical factor in what the United States was able to accomplish and what it was not able to accomplish socially and economically during this volatile period. We remember, we've covered it here at the Virtual Center, we remember that Southern states actually threatened to not sign the Declaration of Independence in 1776 unless Jefferson was willing to take out the paragraphs that he had in his original draft about slavery and the slave trade. And Jefferson's efforts to point out in the Declaration the blatant inconsistencies between the values of the Republic, the freedom, the idea of people's rights to life, liberty, and property being protected from government interference, except when due process is included. All of those values, the value of equality, the idea of equality of opportunity, the value of life and individual freedom, liberty, all of those things that we value seemed to Jefferson to be contradicted by the existence of chattel slavery, principally in the South. The South threatened to not sign the Declaration of Independence unless those clauses related to slavery were taken out of the Declaration. If you read Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention in 1787, you can begin to find 3 or 4 periods during the summer of 1787 when Southern delegates threatened to bolt the convention if they didn't get their way on issues related to the institution of slavery. The famous 3/5 compromise. The South's willingness to go along with the abolition of the slave trade, provided it was postponed for 20 years until 1808. Those are just 2 examples of situations where Southern states threatened to bolt the convention unless their priorities were included in the document being drafted at Philadelphia in 1787. And throughout the nation's early history, the need to compromise with slavery, the very famous Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and its effort on the part of Stephen Douglas to compromise with the South. Lincoln's inaugural in 1861, when basically he drew the line as to the expansion of slavery into the territories, but he pledged that his administration would do nothing to interfere with slavery in states where it already existed. He just would not allow the institution to expand. And the South's recognition that for it and for the institution of slavery not to be able to expand was equivalent to a death penalty for the institution of slavery, and consequently we ended up fighting the Civil War. All during this period, the Industrial Revolution is taking off in what becomes Germany, what becomes Central Europe, what becomes Great Britain, what becomes Ireland. And all you need to do is read Charles Dickens to get a sense of the negative, the downside, if you will, of the Industrial Revolution. The filth and disease and crime and unhealthy living conditions in some of Europe's largest cities. And while there were the beginnings of industrial development here in America, primarily in the textile mills of New England, that growth was limited principally by the need to continually reach political compromise with the South. Once the Civil War ends, and once the trauma of Reconstruction, of bringing the Union back together again, is resolved, as it is by the early 1870s, there's nothing to stop the Industrial Revolution from flexing its muscles in America. And the United States goes from an insignificant industrial power, albeit a major agricultural power, in the 1860s and 70s, to the point where the United States of America becomes a major industrial power by the turn of the century in 1900. In less than 30 years, the Industrial Revolution takes off in America. And part of the reason for that tremendous expansion and tremendous growth is to be explained by the very conservative, hands-off philosophy of the Supreme Court of the United States. Every effort on the part of government to regulate the behavior of business or to regulate the treatment of workers is shelved by the Supreme Court, based on the philosophy which we have come to call laissez-faire, which in French means to leave alone. In other words, let enterprise be. Let capitalism do its thing, without interference and without regulation. In a sense, then, the federal government's responsibility under the Constitution, under the preamble, to promote the general welfare and provide for the public interest, the general interest. Technically, it's called the general welfare, is clearly defined as being giving corporate America its head, its freedom. The reason for that, as much as anything else, I'm going to use this word advisedly, is because of the bastardization of the scientific research of Charles Darwin, where defenders and spokesmen of free enterprise capitalism take Darwin's scientific research out of the realm of nature and apply it directly to the economy and to society. Darwin's conclusions about struggle for existence and survival of the fittest as being the driving forces in nature which are responsible for change in nature, for progress in nature, for what, for lack of a better term, Darwin himself calls evolution, natural change. But research which Darwin himself refuses to apply outside the realm of nature itself. In other words, what Darwin found and proved in hard science and in research is not readily applicable to other areas like economics and sociology and the other areas that make up industrial society. That particular phenomenon, that particular process, is taken up in England by the very famous Herbert Spencer, who comes up with a phrase that he refers to as social Darwinism. And of course, what he does is link the very obvious similarities between the operations of free enterprise capitalism and the evolutionary process as discovered and proven by Darwin in nature. Just as progress in nature is the sum total of competition and struggle for existence, struggle for survival, the strong survive, the weak do not. And the result of that process of constant competition and struggle for research, for resources, for minerals, for sunlight, for moisture, water, appropriate water, temperature, all the rest of it. The constant struggle for existence that goes on in nature results in the fact that the strong make it and the weak don't. And the result of that process is that the strong pass on the genes, the genetic characteristics that make them strong to the next generation. The weak die out. And Darwin argued, proved, that that process of constant regeneration from one generation to the next generation and the transmission of the genetic makeup from one generation to the next means that nature evolves. Change occurs naturally in nature as the genetic makeup of the strong is passed on and the genetic makeup of the weak does not. And to Darwin, that's how progress happens in nature. The similarities with that and the value system which drive free enterprise capitalism are beyond coincidence. Individual freedom, the need to work hard and compete with other people for success, the idea that in the competition for success, some will be successful and some will not. Does that suggest, if you take Darwin to the next step, does that suggest that the future progress of the race, of the civilization, can only be enhanced by allowing the weak to die out and the strong to prevail. That, to Herbert Spencer, is the message of the research of Charles Darwin. That, to Herbert Spencer and those who buy into this theory, this social Darwinist theory, adopt it as the best argument to use against government regulation. Government regulation of corporate behavior skews the natural competition and struggle for success. The interference of government promises to keep alive the unfit and to perpetuate the reproduction of the unfit, which runs totally contrary to Darwin's research. Consequently, what better way to argue against demands for government regulation of corporate behavior, for government regulation of railroad rates, for government regulation of the meatpacking industry, for government regulation of pharmaceuticals, for government regulation of corporate behavior in the way it treats its employees. Why not work children? Isn't it, according to the Supreme Court, a violation of individual freedom for government to pass a law saying that working people can only work a certain number of days, of hours per day or days per week? Isn't that a violation of people's freedom who want to work as many hours as they can in order to make as much as they can? Is government's promotion of the general welfare best served by intervening in the relationship between employers and employee and guaranteeing certain minimum standards of quality in the workplace for working people? Or is government's promotion of the general welfare best served by staying out of that process altogether and letting nature take its course? I would suggest to you, there is the heart of the value system which drives free enterprise capitalism. There is the soul of an anti-regulation value system. Corporations must be free to do their thing without the encumbrance and the hindrance of government red tape and government regulations and the costs that are associated with adhering to government regulations. Consequently, the result is more production, greater profit for corporate America, which in turn means a greater chance to pour profits back into the production process itself, and thereby create more production and, in theory, more jobs. And the idea is, if you overregulate and you begin to tell business what it can do and what it can't do, then you are interfering with a process that Darwin argued had to be left alone, laissez-faire. That's the philosophy of free enterprise. That's what I call the bastardization of Charles Darwin, because Charles Darwin himself argued that this was ridiculous, to take his findings and apply them totally outside the realm in which the research suggested that they naturally existed. That's the beginning, but there's more. We have passed the top of our first hour together. It's 4 minutes after the hour. Let's pause and take a 4 or 5 minute break. We'll be right back for our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Thank you for being with us. I hope you'll stay with us for our second hour. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday afternoon. It is 9 minutes after the hour of 5 here in the East. We welcome you to today's program if you're just joining us. If you've been with us through the first hour, then we especially thank you for staying with us. We've been kind of looking at some of the late 19th century origins, if you will, of a value system, of an anti-regulatory value system. I think an awful lot becomes very clear during this period of American history. It's one of the least studied and yet most important periods in history courses, I believe. Traditionally, most history courses end the Civil War, do something with Reconstruction. It's almost obligatory that you do. Talk about the benefits of the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of the United States as a world power in the 20th century, and then immediately begin to lay the groundwork for World War I. And the period in between there, as to what's going on with the Industrial Revolution, has pretty much been ignored in many of our textbooks throughout our history. I think that's a mistake. And I think what we're seeing right now is behavior and attitudes towards government and towards government regulation that owe their origins to this period. Our phone number, we would love to hear from you. Our phone number, area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate your thoughts and your ideas on some of these things directly to me, independently, then individually, by all means, my email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. We were talking about social Darwinism, which is the transfer of Darwin's research into the realm of human societies, which Darwin himself referred to as poppycock, and could not be done. But obviously, those with an agenda had a very, very clear, real reason to do this. It was the best argument you could possibly come up with against demands for government interference and government regulation. Even more so was it a strong position or a strong foundation for the position against government ownership of the means of production and distribution, i.e. Marxism, socialism, communism. In other words, if you could lay this kind of a value of an environment, of a value system, and at the same time take the most dreaded outcome, which would be government ownership of the means of production and distribution, which Marx advocated in the Communist Manifesto and in Das Kapital, if you could argue against that, then what you were doing was creating the best defense possible for a public opinion that would be wedded to free enterprise, unregulated free enterprise capitalism, and would look askance at any proposal which even smacked of government ownership. And of course, what we end up with in our society is the idea that, to be realistic about it, government regulation can be viewed as a conservative alternative to government ownership. In other words, the best way to demand to counter demand for socialism is with an active regulatory government. I would suggest to you this becomes the operative definition of liberalism, of progressivism. Whereas progressives at the turn of the century, in the early 20th century, have been traditionally viewed as radicals. The fact of the matter is, the progressive movement is led by and defined by middle-class interests in America, who have a vested interest in perpetuating the kind of society we have in America. And the best way to counter demands for socialism, for government ownership of the means of production and distribution, is for an active regulatory government that will make it unnecessary for people to go all the way to something called communism. Theodore Roosevelt referred to this as not radicalism, but the shrewdest form of conservatism. Yet, to be very honest with you, he's dealing with some pretty hard-headed people. Most corporate interests find Roosevelt very, very dangerous and very, very threatening, especially the power he wields in the office of the presidency. And so naturally, the more effective corporate America could be in linking regulation with socialism, with linking big government with socialism, rather than looking at it as a way to prevent socialism, that would be the road that corporate America would most like to travel. The reason I mention this is because that's what we're seeing with the attacks from the right on President Obama. It is absolutely ludicrous to anybody who knows anything about socialism to suggest that a president who is willing to take billions of dollars of public tax money and use it to bail out banks and large corporations, to label that socialism is beyond bizarre. It must be explained only because those who do it believe that they can get away with it, believe that the American public is gullible enough to buy that. I would suggest to you that what Professor McGinley was saying on the Law Works program on West Virginia Public Television last Thursday evening was just that. The general population of West Virginia has looked at government regulation, at big government, as a more active, intrusive EPA, as a direct threat to West Virginians' motto, Montani semper liberi. Mountaineers are always free. I would suggest to you that freedom from a regulatory Washington does not necessarily mean freedom. It means freedom for the corporate interests in West Virginia. It does not mean freedom for the working people of West Virginia. And I think that's a particular issue that we need to focus on. One of the things that makes the Industrial Revolution so very successful and explosive in late 19th century America is the application of science to the nation's challenges, to the nation's economy. The application of electricity, for example, to transportation and communication, and the revolution that that produces. electricity makes it possible for manufacturing to occur in places other than on major rivers, because no longer does industry need water power in order to generate electricity. That kind of the application of science and the application of new discoveries, the applications of technology to the industrial process, is in large part what makes the Industrial Revolution as revolutionary as it in effect becomes. Many people tend to associate the application of Darwin's scientific research to the Industrial Revolution as yet another example of that. And I would suggest to you, in this case, it's not the application of science, it's the manipulation of science in order to support a political agenda. And so we have to be very, very careful as to what constitutes science and what constitutes a bastardization of science, the manipulation of science, the inaccurate manipulation of science. One of the things that has amazed me over the years in education is that during this period is born a phenomenon that we call the social sciences. Everybody who's ever gone to college has at least in one point or another run into the term the social sciences. And as we as college students have been advised in our curriculum, as advisors have told us which courses we want to take depending on what our major course of study is going to be. Colleges and universities have developed what they call a support program of what is usually referred to as general education, general studies. And usually general studies requirements, regardless of major, have included a certain number of the so-called social sciences. I know in the college that I was affiliated with for more than 20 years, in advising students, I had to be very, very careful to make sure that all students, irrespective of what they were going to end up majoring in, whether they were going to be business majors or accountants, whether they were going to be chemists or biologists, whether they were going to be major in English, history, government, or whatever, all students had to meet certain requirements in what were called the social sciences and the humanities. That's part of what we called and bragged about a liberal education. A liberal arts education, a broad-based education, was one that had to include a certain number of courses in the humanities and the social sciences. Generally, the humanities were literature, languages, philosophy. Those would be the humanities, the arts, music, theater. So, for example, in our particular situation, every student who graduated from Concord University had to have at least 2 courses in the humanities. And their choices were history of art, history of music, or history of theater, in addition to required courses in English and in literature. We wanted our graduates to be well-founded in the liberal arts. So we required that of the 3 classes I named, music, art, or theater, every student had to graduate with at least 2 of those 3 disciplines, had to take 2 of those 3 classes as part of their general studies. Because we wanted all of our graduates, whatever their major, to be conversant and familiar with the arts and with music and with theater. Also, all of our graduates had to take at least 4 social science classes. And the social science disciplines were identified. Students had a choice. They weren't required to take certain social science classes, but they had to take at least 4, and they had to mix them up. In other words, all 4 classes couldn't be in the same discipline. You couldn't take all 4 classes in economics, or all 4 classes in history, or all 4 classes in sociology, or all 4 classes in psychology. So the social science disciplines were psychology, sociology, history, government, political science, economics, geography. Students were required to take at least 4 courses, identified courses in those disciplines. And we had certain courses, certain geography classes, certain political science classes, certain history classes, certain sociology classes, and certain psychology classes that carried the label general studies. And students had to take 4 of those courses in at least 3 different disciplines. In other words, they couldn't load up in any one subject. They could take a 2-semester history course, for example, but they couldn't take any more history. They had to take psychology or sociology or economics or something like that. Business majors, intended business majors, had to make one of their social science choices economics. Economics was a required 2-semester economics course was a required class for all business majors. It was an elective for everybody else. And most people never think about this, but it is during this period of late 19th century that the idea of social sciences emerges. For a second, I would ask you to reflect upon the very term social science. The implication is that the studies of these areas related to society itself are sciences. The study of politics, of government, is a science. The study of society itself is a science. The study of human behavior, psychology, is a science. The study of the economic system is a science. The study of geography is a science. The study of the nation's history or the history of the West is a science. The implications of that, I think, are very, very incredible, very informative and incredible as well. Because of all of those disciplines, psychology, sociology, economics, political science, geography, history, there's only one, history, which is sometimes not included within the social sciences at all, but instead is listed as a humanities class. History is the one that doesn't quite fit all of those others. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out why. Until several years ago, I began to attend meetings of an organization called the National Association of Scholars. And I began to appreciate the value of scholars from a number of different disciplines coming together to deliver papers, professional papers, and to conduct discussions in the value of research and scholarship, in the value of the pursuit of knowledge. But quickly I began to realize that of all of those disciplines that we call social sciences, history is the only one that really does involve the pursuit of knowledge. All the rest of the social sciences presume that truth is already known. Political science is the study of representative government. It is based on the assumption that representative government, the government that we have, Republican government, government which includes the term republicanism and democracy, these are the true political sciences. In other words, what political science study are the intricacies of this form of government. But all of it is based on the assumption that this form of government is the only form of government that works. Consequently, the research tends to be skewed by this major assumption. Economics is a social science, the science of free of capitalism. Again, driven by the assumption that capitalism is the best, therefore the only legitimate economic system, the only way for society to organize itself for the benefit of its people is this way. I am not saying that that's not true. I am saying that the study of economics is based on that assumption. That question is never asked. Economists spend their time focusing on the intricacies of the operation, the functioning of free enterprise capitalism as an economic system. But their research never goes into the areas of whether in fact this is the best or indeed the only system that benefits mankind. That is assumed to be true. Psychology as a social science. The idea that human behavior can be scientifically studied, scientifically researched, and scientifically mastered. The school of psychology that becomes all-powerful and all-popular in the late 19th century is what we call behavioral psychology. Behavioral psychology is driven by very famous research projects. The one I'm thinking of is the one by the Russian psychologist Pavlov. And the research that is usually identified as Pavlov's dogs. Everyone who's ever taken introductory psychology in college has been exposed to Pavlov's research. If you take two dogs in a cage and you feed these dogs, and then on a regular basis, and then you suddenly withhold food until the dog performs a required behavioral trick. So, for example, if you present the food but don't give the dog the food, the dog will salivate. Then if you add the ringing of a bell, in other words, as you present the food to the dog and the dog begins to salivate, you ring a bell and then you give the dog the food. If you do that often enough and long enough, the dog will begin to salivate at the sound of the bell, whether in fact there is food there or not. In other words, you can control the dog and make the dog salivate with the ringing of a bell. What we are talking about here is the relationship between a desired response and an appropriate stimulus. And what psychologists are researching in the late 19th century is the effectiveness of stimulus response as a way to predict and ultimately control human behavior. Naturally, behavioral psychology becomes the key ingredient of most teacher preparation programs in colleges and universities. Because what better tool to put in the hands of skilled teachers than the ability to manipulate students into learning what you want them to learn, even if they have no interest in learning it at all, by providing the appropriate stimulus. If students know that there's a reward at the end, they will perform accordingly. If animals learn that there's a reward at the end, they will respond accordingly. Thus, in the late 19th century, for all practical purposes, we have scientifically demonstrated the value of teaching built around the stimulus response model. Psychology has become a science. And it is one of the more popular sciences. And there's a whole magazine that comes out every month called Psychology Today, in which you can read about the latest research projects, which tend to reinforce the idea that human behavior can be predicted, can be defined, and can be controlled. It's a science. Think about the problems that the United States of America is facing in the late 19th century as a result, literally, of the overnight explosion of America's largest industrial cities, populated by people from all over the world who come to the city in pursuit of jobs. People of different religions, people of different nationalities, people that speak different languages, people that come from totally different ethnic backgrounds, people whose hair colors are different, people whose eye coloring is different, people whose language is different, people whose religions are different, people whose color is different. All of them living within the confines of overcrowded, unhealthy cities unable to develop fast enough appropriate residences to accommodate human beings, to develop adequate sewer systems, to generate the kind of food that is necessary to feed exploding populations, to deal with the expansion and growth of crime and disease and overcrowding in unhealthy living conditions. People who are working in unregulated factory and industrial conditions, an inordinate number of hours, with insufficient breaks, at inadequate pay that is oftentimes reduced depending on the needs and priorities of the employer. And these people are screaming for relief, are screaming for help, and they naturally look to government to get it. A government that is operating under the philosophies best defined in the world of nature by Charles Darwin. A corporate environment that is being defined by the philosophy of laissez-faire, which is being reinforced with the scientific findings of one Charles Darwin, which argues against government relief for the poor, argues against the interference with the natural laws of the market, the natural laws of supply and demand. Let the market define need. Don't interfere, because in doing that, potentially you are keeping the unfit alive, and you are jeopardizing the very progress of society itself. And we have all sorts of scientific evidence to prove this. We have the research findings of our sociologists, which suggest the best way to keep an increasingly diverse population that is exploding in America's cities peaceful and able to coexist and live together is to integrate the schools, is to require mandatory education of all people, and force the schools to integrate different nationalities, different religions, different races, to create what in the 19th century sociologists began to refer to affectionately as a melting pot. America's cities become a melting pot. America becomes a melting pot. And out of the mix of nationalities, out of the mix of races, out of the mix of a variety of different ethnic groups, out of the mix of a variety of languages, you put it all into this pot and you stir it up, and out comes something called an American. A person who has been indoctrinated into an appropriate value system to support the free enterprise economic system that is underway. A system which becomes difficult to challenge because scientists, a particular group of scientists that we have come to call economists, are bringing chapter and verse in research to prove beyond a doubt that this is the best economic system for mankind. This offers the most, the very best. And people begin to question the unfairness of government and government favoritism towards corporations, government's willingness to respond to big money. And consequently, they begin to challenge these illicit political relationships. And in response to those challenges comes the research of political scientists who make recommendations as to how best to tweak the system in order to make sure that the political system which best supports this economic system will work the way it should work. And then you turn to solving the problems of America's cities and the urban sprawl and the diversity that exists within urban America, and the crime and the hostility and the potential violence that is building up within America's cities. And you turn to the appropriate scientists to solve that. In this case, we call these scientists sociologists. And the sociologists begin to do the kind of research that empowers them to make the recommendations on how best to manage and organize America's cities in such a way that you make human accommodation to the realities of industrial America possible. And then you bring in another group of scientists called psychologists, and they begin to share with us the kind of research which shows the most appropriate stimulus response mechanism that is necessary to solve the problems of urban industrial America. And the implication is that all of these different brands of science become the agencies of government. And government moves in the public interest to apply the various and sundry applications of scientific research to the problems of urban and industrial America. And as long as we call it science, it's very difficult to refute. The only one of those social sciences that is different is history. And the reason for that is that historical research, true historical research, involves the pursuit of truth. Every other one of those disciplines is based on the assumption that truth is already known. We already know the proper economic system. We already know the proper political system. We already know the proper mechanism to resolve the problems of a diverse society. It's called the melting pot. It's called integration. It's called turning our schools from vehicles that educate youngsters into institutions that indoctrinate them. The major the major educational reform of this period is the introduction of the American high school. The requirement, not just that kids go to school for a minimum number of years in order to learn the appropriate value system, but the idea that the only way that society can protect itself is to require that students go to school for a long time, until they reach the age of 16 years old, until they complete high school or turn 16, whichever becomes first. These becomes state requirements, but they are state-driven reforms that serve a national purpose, which is to keep kids in school long enough to indoctrinate them and hopefully to teach them the minimal skills that they will need in order to get a job in industrial America. The operative assumption being that very few of these people are going to be going to Harvard or Stanford or the University of Chicago or anywhere else. Of course, we do have Jefferson's model of periodic skimmings of the cream of ability to identify the talent and scholarship those students. But the general operative assumption is the vast majority of immigrants coming into this country are coming in to get jobs to work in the factories. Our entire education system models itself on supporting this economic reality. Our students go to school during the regular school day, and they are learned to respond to bells. Periods begin with a bell. Periods end with a bell. Students are lined up in rows. Students are marched from one class to the other class. The model of the military, the model of basic training, becomes the model of education in our nation, the majority of our nation's public schools. Because only military discipline will control the uncontrollable until the value system takes. That requires more years than Jefferson's 3. It requires more years than just completion of elementary school. It requires more years than junior high school. It requires the age of 16. 12 years of mandatory public education in which parents are encouraged to turn their children over to the state with the idea that at the end of it, there will be a job. And we will have an educated citizenry, educated well enough to perform the job that is being defined by industrialism. I would suggest to you it was fine for the late 19th and early 20th century. In the 21st century, it can't work anymore. It can't work anymore. It is killing us. Schools are modeled on the 9-month school year built around agriculture, built around the fact that many of these people grew up in rural America and now are moving into the cities in order to get jobs. And we have all of these immigrants, 5 million immigrants in the year 1905 alone, come into the United States. What is America to do with this kind of a population other than to retool it into something very unique called the American? And what defines that American is not color, it is not accent, it is not language, it is not religion, it is not nation of ethnic origin. It is values. It is the values which have been defined and developed in order to support the system of free enterprise capitalism which has been developed and is currently underway. It is a value system which helps explain very well the political system which functions hand in hand with that economic system. A value system based on the idea of Republican government, of participatory government, where everybody participates in making the rules and making the laws under which they live. But a degree of participation which is clearly defined. I would suggest to you that in America, as we enter the 20th century, the definition of the term democracy is increasingly defined as being able to participate in the political process. The founders knew, Madison knew what democracy was. Democracy was majority rule. But the definition of democracy that emerges in America at the beginning of the 20th century is participatory democracy, the right to participate in making the rules by electing the people who make the decisions. I would suggest to you that that is not the definition of democracy that James Madison used. James Madison was afraid of the majority faction because he was afraid of majority democracy. The definition of democracy that we have adopted is one that works very well in this political, economic, social system that we call the modern United States of America. It is a system which supports a nation which, in a matter, in history's terms, relatively overnight, has moved from a relatively insignificant nation in a world of nations to one of the major, most dominant political powers, industrial powers in the world. It is a major competitor as being the dominant industrial power. World War I in Europe eliminates the competition. It destroys Europe and leaves the United States as the major industrial power in the world. Consequently, the United States dominates the 20th century world. Its people are raised in a value system based on the idea that they were born and bred to dominate the world. Because of technology, because of the internet, no longer is the United States of America dominating anything. And we have instead developed a value system to support a world that no longer exists. More and more evidence, in quotes, scientific evidence, to prove that we are right. And once you are sure you are right, then there's nothing wrong with defining everything else as being an untruth, as being a threat. Consequently, there's nothing wrong with keeping foreign ideas and foreign books out of the hands of American youth. If you protect and control what information gets into the hands of our young people, then you don't need to teach them the skills that they would need in order to understand and to know. You are basically riding herd over exactly what it is they must know, they should know. And to accept that as truth because you say it is. We had better get about our business. I think a good start is here at the Head On Radio Network, and hopefully here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is 58 minutes after the hour. Bob Kincaid is chomping at the bit to visit with you and tell us all about his weekend. I want to thank you for being with us today. I want to tell you how much I have enjoyed being back here at the Virtual Center with you. Please be safe. We want you back. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good evening.